she stepped off the train into a town that never asked for her. He was the kind of man folks had stopped seeing long ago. Two people out of place until they found their place in each other. And then came the ones who tried to tear it all apart. Welcome to Weathered Stories. Today, you're going to hear a story about a man who lost everything and still found something worth fighting for. Ready to hear how a stranger changed the life of a lonely farmer and his boy? Then hit that like button and let's begin. The wind dragged dust across the cracked earth like it was trying to wipe the land clean. Edward Harper's house stood alone on a hill, gray, sagging, its shutters banging in the breeze. The porch boards groaned beneath his boots as he stepped outside and leaned against the railing. He stared out toward the scorched horizon, where the setting sun stained the sky with rust-colored streaks. And in that silence, not peaceful, but hollow and sharp, his pain stirred once again. Since Ellis died, everything had collapsed inward. First the fever took her, swept through the county like a storm. Then the crops failed. Then the livestock. Now there was only Josh, barefoot, skinny, all tousled hair and wild eyes that sometimes held a weight no child should carry. Edward didn't live for himself anymore. He buried that part of him alongside his wife beneath the old elm on the back slope. Now his whole world lived in a little boy with a carved wooden horse, in a cracked pot, a crust of bread, and the faint glow of a stove fire that always seemed on the verge of going out. The farm was dying. The land wouldn't listen. Chickens keeled over, the roof leaked, and the debts kept piling up. Folks in town looked at him like a ghost. Once, he was the loudest laugh at the local bar. Now, people barely nodded as he passed. He didn't feel much anymore. But when Josh laughed, talking about cowboys, building forts from hay, running barefoot in the dirt, for a moment, it felt like life still existed in that house. But every evening brought the same thing. A dim light in the window. Plates with more emptiness than food. A man with eyes that had forgotten how to look forward. And a silence deep enough to drown in. Still, he kept going. Because the boy needed a father. Even if the man he'd once been was already gone. The knock came early, before dawn. Not loud, but firm. The kind you couldn't ignore. Edward lifted his head from a cold mug of yesterday's coffee. Josh was still asleep, curled up on the floor mattress by the stove. Clyde Bennett stood on the porch, an old horseman, the kind who always knew more than he let on. Dust clung to his beard, frost to his hat. He looked like he'd ridden through the night. "Morning ain't bringing much good, Ed," he muttered without a hello. "You better come see for yourself. We got us a guest. Bride came in on the early train. Problem is groom never showed." Edward frowned. "And she's still standing there, like a calf in the rain." Folks, being their usual kind selves, Logan, pointing. "You know how it goes." He hadn't planned on getting involved. Other people's troubles weren't his business. But there was something in Clyde's voice. Not gossip. A warning. Maybe even a call for help. "What's it got to do with me?" Edward asked. Clyde scratched his chin. "Don't know. Just figured you'd want to know. Before something happens to her. Town's not exactly known for its mercy these days." Clyde turned and left just as quickly as he'd come, boots crunching over the frostbitten ground. He left behind a trail of cold air and something heavier, a quiet sense of dread. Edward stayed on the porch, listening to the wind stir through the bare trees, empty and restless. The Howell Creek station was barely more than a wooden platform, a crooked sign, and a watchman's shack that smelled of kerosene and dusty tobacco. Morning sunlight had just started cutting through the fog, casting a glow on the mist rising from the warm ground. Edward walked up slow, steady, like he just happened to be passing through. But Clyde's voice still echoed in his mind. A small crowd had already gathered by the platform. Some held coffee, others a spit cup. The women huddled together, whispering behind their hands. The men tossed out jokes loud enough for themselves to laugh at, never mind who else was listening. And there she was, Grace Meadows, tall, broad-shouldered, in a heavy brown coat and a tilted hat. Two worn-out suitcases sat at her feet, one with a busted corner. She stood like a stone, back straight, eyes fixed on something far beyond the tracks. But Edward noticed her chin was trembling. "Big girl showed up, huh?" someone muttered. Probably thought she'd walk into a fairy tale. Ain't many doors open for her kind. Bet the guy skipped town soon as he saw her picture, another added. or took one look and threw himself in the river. Grace didn't flinch. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. Not tears, just the heat of anger rising under her cheekbones. That's when Edward stepped forward. He didn't even know why. Not for her. Not for justice. Just couldn't stand there and watch. "What's all the noise about?" he said. The voices fell off. Someone coughed. Another looked away. They knew Edward. Or rather, they remembered who he used to be. Woman came in. Nobody showed to meet her. Someone mumbled. "That's all." "Then it's none of your damn business," Edward said, voice low and tired, but solid. "Move along." People shifted back. Some looked embarrassed. A few grunted, turned, and walked away. He turned to her. "You all right?" he asked. She looked at him, cautious, like she expected the punchline to come next. "You gonna make a joke too?" "No," he said. "I stopped laughing a long time ago." They stood there, quiet, two strangers wrapped in their own weather. Then she gave a slight nod and looked away. But something in her shifted. Edward felt it. He bent down, picked up one of her bags. No questions. No explanations. "Let's go," he said. They walked in silence, past a few scattered buildings where lights flickered in the windows and dogs barked at unfamiliar shadows. Grace's breath was heavy, not from the walk, but from holding back too much all at once. The suitcase thumped against her leg with every step, but she didn't ask to stop. Edward walked ahead without turning around, carrying her second bag like it weighed nothing, just another sack of potatoes. But they both knew it was more than that. It was everything she had left. When they reached the fork in the road, he stopped. "My place." Edward cleared his throat, voice rough. "It's not much. Roof holds. Stove works. And it'd probably settle my boy some, having someone there besides just me." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but there was barbed wire behind it, built over years. "You don't know me. I could be a runaway. Or not who I say I am." He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just a woman who was promised a new life, then left behind." He met her eyes, calm, no pity. "I know what it feels like to have nowhere to go." She didn't answer right away. Just let out a long breath, like she was blowing the dust off a shield. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right, lead on." The Harper house greeted them with cold drafts and the smell of damp wood. The walls were dark, like they'd absorbed too many winters. Cracks in the floor ran like scars. Grace set her suitcase down by the wall and looked around, not with pity, but with attention. Everything teetered on the edge. The stove smoked, the front door hung by a single hinge, and the dishes on the shelf were chipped but clean. From behind a curtain, a little blond boy peeked out, freckled face, wooden toy horse in his hand. "You staying with us now?" he asked, like he was asking about a new rooster out in the yard. "Looks like it," Grace said, crouching down to his level. "I'm Josh." "I'm Grace." He held out his toy. "Pa keeps it in the drawer when he's real mad. But you can have it." She smiled, surprised and a little unsure. Not because of the toy. Because of you can. Like he'd already decided to trust her. No questions asked. Edward was outside chopping wood. He hadn't said a word after letting her in, didn't show her a room, didn't offer coffee. Just nodded and disappeared. She understood. He let her in the door, but not into his life. Not yet. Grace didn't push. She went to work. Wiped down the table, scrubbed the stove, found an old rag and dusted everything that looked like it hadn't been touched since his wife died. She wasn't there to be a burden. She was there to help whatever way she could. That evening, Edward walked in and stopped cold. The air smelled like fried onions and potatoes. The table was set simple meal, but neat, like someone cared. "You do this?" he asked, short. "Who else?" She replied without turning from the pot. He said nothing. Just sat down, picked up a spoon, and ate. Slowly, like it had been a long, long time since food tasted like anything. Grace didn't expect thanks. But when Josh laughed, talking about a chicken that supposedly learned to fly, and Edward let out a breath, soft, almost unnoticed, she knew. Day one was behind them, and more days were coming. By morning, the house smelled of smoke again. But not the bitter kind. This time it was alive, fried dough, scorched coffee, and fresh wood. Grace was up before the sun. The mattress creaked beneath her, and the blanket was thin, but it wasn't the cold that kept her awake. It was the weight of proving she wasn't a burden, not someone rescued. Someone needed. She started with the water, heavy buckets from the well. Then the stove. By the time the sky had turned from black to gray, she'd scrubbed the floors, stitched the torn sleeve on Josh's jacket, and gone through what little food was left. There wasn't much, but she knew how to stretch nothing into enough. On the third day, Edward came closer. Not with words, just quiet watching. He stood while she repaired the chicken coop. Her hands worked slow, sure. The hammer in her grip didn't strike hard. It struck like it respected the wood. "You work a farm before?" he asked, eyes on the boards. "When my brother died," she said. "Someone had to. Wasn't anyone else left to haul hay? You manage." She looked at him sideways. "What do you think?" He didn't answer. But a few minutes later, he set a box of nails beside her feet. Didn't say a word, just left them there. Josh followed her around all day like a shadow with bare feet. Showed her the chickens, told her about the time he saw a coyote and Pa didn't believe him. She listened, laughed loud, rough-edged, but warm, like bread straight from the oven. And the boy lit up around her. The house felt bigger somehow. Walls didn't press in so tight. Silence didn't ring so loud. That night, they all sat down to dinner. Stewed beans, homemade bread, and a little butter she'd managed to churn from leftover cream. Edward ate in silence, but not with that same heavy distance. More like he was remembering what it felt like to eat beside someone. Not just for survival, but for the sake of sharing. For the sake of home. "I can take some work out in the fields," Grace said, after Josh had gone to bed. "If you're all right with that." "Do what you think needs doing," Edward replied. His voice wasn't as hard as it used to be. Grace didn't smile. But she knew. The wall hadn't come down, but it had cracked. And through that crack, a little light had started to slip in. In Howell Creek, gossip spread like weeds in dry soil. Fast, clinging, and poisonous. Grace only had to show up at the store twice with a basket in hand before the whispering grew louder than the greetings. "Did you see her carry that log by herself?" they muttered outside the church. "A woman shouldn't be doing that." "She's no woman. She's a witch," someone else said. Got Edward wrapped around her finger. "He don't say a word anymore." Bet she slipped him something. He was a ghost after his wife passed. Now look at him, acting alive. Edward heard it all. At the feed store. At the post office. At the edge of every room. At first, he kept quiet. Then he started clenching his fists in his pockets. But he didn't strike back. He knew too well, anger doesn't cure ignorance. When Edward finally told Grace about the talk, not word for word, but she could read it on his face, she gave a crooked smile. "Let him talk," she said simply. "If that's what they need, let him have it." "Doesn't bother you?" he asked. She looked him dead in the eye. "No, but I've seen what happens when you let snakes keep biting. Best to keep walking and not look back." Edward gave a slow nod. And in that moment, he realized she was stronger than he'd thought. And maybe he could use a little of that strength too. The morning sky hung low, heavy and gray, like the heavens themselves were pressing down with quiet threat. Edward was fixing the feeder by the barn when he heard hooves. Not a casual ride. A purpose. He stood up, pliers still in hand. Dust kicked along the road told him who it was before the rider got close. Doyle. Sam Doyle. Big, slick, smiling that empty smile no one ever really trusted. His horse stopped at the gate, almost like it didn't want to step foot on the land. "Harper," Doyle drawled, lazy as ever. "Come to talk business." "You always do, Sam," Edward replied, staying where he was. "Land's hanging by a thread," Doyle said, pulling a rolled-up paper from his coat. "But this little piece of parchment, real solid. You owe. Long overdue. And the law's got my back." Edward stepped forward. No rush, no bark, just that kind of quiet that carries its own weight. Then Grace stepped out of the house. Sleeves rolled, hair tied back, face calm. Not a trace of fear. "We're not hiding anything," she said. "He works. I work. So what exactly are you bringing us? Debts or threats?" Doyle looked her over, long and slow, like a man checking the price of something he'd never afford. "Well, look who finally shows her face," he sneered. "A little too sharp-tongued for a lady, a little too sturdy. What's the story? You cast a spell on him." Grace didn't flinch. "Maybe you're just not used to women who don't stand behind men. I'm used to women who know their place." Edward took another step and stood between them. My place is right here, he said. And so is hers. You want to fight, Sam? Go ahead and start it. But don't expect me to step aside. For a beat, everything froze. Even the wind held its breath. Doyle said nothing, just rolled up his papers, tugged the reins. I'll be back. With proof. With law. Grace didn't blink. Bring your conscience too, she called after him. When the dust settled, Edward turned to her. She stood there steady, like a tree that had taken its share of storms and was still rooted deep. He meant to say something. Anything. But the words didn't come. She spoke for him. Thank you. He nodded. Just once. But in that single motion, there was more than in all the silent days before. The days passed, and the house no longer felt dead. Grace patched the roof where the cold used to creep in. Edward tightened the beams in silence while she steadied the ladder. She oiled the squeaky hinges on the barn. He fixed the broken doorknob. They barely spoke. But every task, every gesture said enough. Each morning, she made porridge. It wasn't much for flavor, but it filled the belly. Josh ate it up like it was a feast, laughing more and more each day. He chased Grace through the yard, spinning stories mid-run, pretending to be a wild horse or hiding from imaginary bears. She listened, played along, and sometimes just watched him live, with a softness in her eyes that surprised even her. Now and then, Josh would fall asleep in her lap. Edward would stop in the doorway, not stepping in, just standing there, watching the two of them. A woman gently brushing his son's hair. A boy breathing calm, like the world had finally made room for peace again. Sometimes their eyes met, hers and Edward's. His look was warm but guarded. He'd turn away quickly. And she never asked why. Because deep down, she wasn't sure what she was feeling either. Attachment? Gratitude? Or that quiet, growing bond that doesn't come with declarations. Just from surviving the same long winter. Even when the leaves outside still said fall. One evening, after Josh was asleep and they sat on the porch with tin cups in hand, Edward said, "You've done a lot." She looked at him. "Just doing what I can." He nodded. And the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was steady, the kind shared by people who don't need words to be understood. And in that silence, they both felt something shifting. Lighter. Closer. They were out behind the house, near the goat pen. Josh sat with a splintered stick in hand, sharpening it with a rock like it was a sword. Grace was wringing out a rag when he suddenly asked, "Have you always been this strong?" She froze for a second, then knelt down beside him. "No," she said. "I used to just be Grace. Thought I'd grow up to be a teacher. Or maybe a baker. What happened? My brother died," she said softly. "We didn't have parents. The farm got left to me." "You did everything yourself?" "Everything," she nodded. Fixed fences, milked cows, hauled feed bags. Dresses didn't last long. And sitting proper went out the window. Josh looked at her with that kind of serious only kids can muster. The kind that says they're truly listening, truly feeling it. "But you didn't turn mean," he said. "No," she smiled. "I just became different. Not the kind of girl folks expected, but the kind who knows how to hold a shovel and doesn't run when the dogs start barking." He gave a little nod, like he was learning something important. "I like that you're not scared." She ruffled his hair. "Sometimes I am, Josh. I just don't let it show. That's what strength is." He leaned into her side, and in that simple movement was more trust than 100 spoken promises. It started with a chicken dead, neck twisted, tossed right at the gate. Then came the tracks by the barn. Heavy boots. Deep prints. Like someone wanted to be noticed. And then the writing. Scrawled in charcoal across the boards, rough and angry. "Leave before it's too late." Edward stared at the words for a long time. His face didn't move, but his fingers curled slowly into a fist. "Doyle," he said flatly. "Or one of his dogs." Not even trying to be clever. Grace didn't respond. She looked at the message, then at Josh, gathering feathers from the ground, eyes wide with a fear no child should ever learn. The next morning, they found the dog. Old. Dead. A deep gash down its side. It lay stiff beneath the porch. Josh knelt beside it, hands trembling, trying not to cry. Grace rested a hand on his back. Her own strength was wearing thin. Edward stepped inside, opened the cabinet, and pulled out the rifle. He sat by the window, cleaned it slow, silent, like a man who already knew what needed doing. "He won't stop," Edward said finally. He's not trying to scare me. He's trying to break me. Force me off this land. But I'll end it. Grace stepped closer. Not alone, she said. You're not doing this alone, Ed. Grace stood at the table, hands deep in flour, kneading dough for flatbread. Edward walked in through the front door, soaked from the morning mist. The rifle hung over his shoulder. His face was set, hard. I'm going to town, he said. Time to settle this. Alone. She wiped her hands, stepped closer. Alone? What does that make me? You've already been through enough, he said. Doyle's not after justice. He just wants a reason to strike. And you think if I leave, he'll call it off? He didn't reply, just shrugged, tired. I'm not leaving, Edward, she said firmly. I've backed down before, and I learned something. The pain of running is worse than the pain of standing your ground. You won't face this alone. He looked at her, long deep, like he was seeing her for the first time. This isn't just land, Grace. This is what's left of who I am. She didn't blink. And I'm not just a woman carrying someone else's suitcase. I'm part of this now, whether we planned it or not. Silence settled between them, thick like chimney smoke. Then Edward gave a quiet nod. Then we get ready. The next few days, they worked without speaking much. Repaired the fence. Reinforced the windows. Edward pulled out old traps and laid them around the edges of the property. Grace found a hunting rifle in the shed, cleaned it, checked it over like she'd done it before. In the evenings, they sat by the stove, listening to the soft crackle of firewood. The house was quiet, but this time the quiet wasn't fear. It was resolve. The dawn was cold and dry. Frost clung to the grass along the ravine like a thin white warning. Edward and Grace rode together, following the trail from the broken fence down toward the river valley. Grace's fingers were stiff, barely gripping the reins, but her chest burned with fire. Edward rode ahead, quiet, shoulders tight, gaze locked forward. The tracks were fresh cow hooves and heavy boot prints, all leading to the water. The cattle grazed near the bank, scattered and uneasy. Two men stood nearby. One had a rifle. The other wore a grin, the kind of grin worn by men who think nothing can touch them. Well, Harper, one of them called out, you come to take back what's yours, or say goodbye. Edward dismounted. Grace followed. He stepped in front of her like a wall of flesh and will. You've got one chance to walk away, Edward said. Take it. The second man raised his rifle. We've got orders, he said. And we're getting paid to make sure you don't stand in the way anymore. The shot cracked out fast, loud as thunder. Edward flinched, moving to shield himself, but too late. The second man lifted his weapon again. But Grace was already aiming. No time to think. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the valley. One of Doyle's men went down hard, clutching his shoulder, rifle spinning into the weeds. The second stumbled and dropped just as Edward's bullet caught him square. Silence fell, sharp and sudden. Grace stood frozen, breathing hard, the rifle still tight in her trembling hands. It felt heavier now, like it carried more than iron and wood. Edward turned slowly, eyes wide with surprise and something else. Something warm, almost fragile. You saved me, he said. Grace exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't about to lose what matters. He nodded. That was all that needed to be said. They rode back slow. The cattle wandered ahead, scattered in a clumsy line of spotted hides. Behind them, tracks, blood, and spent shells. There were no words, only hoofbeats crunching on hard earth, and the kind of cold that made even breath feel brittle. Grace stayed steady in the saddle, but her hands still shook. Not from the chill, but from what had happened, from what she'd done. The rifle on her back felt heavy now, like borrowed guilt. Edward rode beside her, his shirt soaked with blood, his own. Shoulder hit, jaw clenched, face pale. But his eyes, they were alive, and that was what mattered. As they rounded the last bend, the farmhouse came into view. Josh stood at the gate barefoot, hair wild, like he'd sensed them coming. Pa, Grace, he yelled, running to them. You're okay. They dismounted. Edward staggered slightly, but stayed upright. Grace moved to steady him. Josh threw his arms around his father's good arm, then turned and wrapped himself around Grace's waist. You ran him off, didn't you? Grace didn't speak. She just nodded. You're real heroes, Josh said, loud, proud. They didn't answer. Just stood there, covered in dust and pain, staring at each other. No smiles. No celebration. Just alive. And for now, that was enough. At first, it was quiet, like the town had gone still, holding its breath. But silence in Howl Creek was never safe. It was just the sound before the judgment. When Edward rode into town for supplies, nobody said a word. The store clerk handed him flour and salt without looking him in the eye. Somewhere behind him, someone whispered, "They're killing now just to keep that land." He didn't respond, just paid, nodded, and walked out. The weight of every stare clinging to him like spring mud. Grace came 2 days later. It was worse. The bakery wouldn't sell to her. At the post office, they asked her to repeat her name like they'd never heard it. Even the kids who used to wave stayed back now, while their mothers called them away, voices sharp, look sharper. "They see us as a threat," Edward said that night, sitting on the porch, wrapping his shoulder with a strip of cloth. A threat to their order, to the way they think life's supposed to be, who belongs inside the fence and who doesn't. Grace didn't say anything at first. She rinsed the soot from her hands, then sat down beside him. "I'm used to it," she said calmly. "Spent my whole life being told where I belong. First the kitchen, then the hallway, then a train bound for nowhere, with no return ticket." She turned to him. "But I'm here, not because I have to be." Her voice was steady. "I'm here because I want to be." He looked at her then, not like a man looks at a woman, but like someone seeing the truth, for what it really is. "I can't protect you from all of them," he said. "I don't need you to," she replied. "I'm not looking for a shield. I'm looking for solid ground. And you gave it to me. Now I'm holding it with you." There was no pride in her voice, just silence, and the kind of truth that comes from being burned and still standing. The rumors didn't stop. The town kept whispering. But back at the Harper farm, the stove burned warm. The dishes clinked softly, and Josh laughed again, as Grace taught him how to sharpen a nail. That was their truth, and it held, even when the town tried to speak louder. They came before sunrise. 6 riders in dust-covered coats, rifles slung over their shoulders. Doyle led the pack, wearing a black hat like it was part of the sentence he came to deliver. His face held the smug certainty of a man who'd gotten away with too much for too long. Grace saw them first through the window. She didn't flinch, just rested her hand on the rifle by the wall, then walked over and quietly woke Edward. He didn't ask questions. He knew. The time had come. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch. Behind them, home, and Josh, hidden inside with a knife in hand, trying to hold back the trembling in his voice like a man twice his age. "Harper," Doyle called from horseback. "This is it. You had your chance to leave clean. Now we're taking it. Your house, your land, all of it." "Over my dead body," Edward said. No rage, just a statement of fact. Doyle smirked and waved his hand. 2 men dismounted and started toward the porch. Grace raised her rifle first. The shot cracked like thunder, bouncing off the fields. One of Doyle's men dropped, clutching his shoulder. The second backed up, panicked. But Edward fired too, hitting the dirt right in front of his boots. "Next one hits the heart," Edward said. Silence fell, cold and tight. One rider turned and left. Then another. 3 remained. "And Doyle, you're backing down because of her?" he shouted. "A woman." "Because of the truth," Grace shot back. "Something you've never met." Doyle jerked his reins, lifted his rifle in one motion. But Edward didn't move. He fired first. The bullet cut through the morning and buried itself in Doyle's chest. The man tumbled from his saddle like a sack of spoiled grain, hit the ground hard, and didn't rise. The others didn't wait. They wheeled around and vanished into the gray light. Edward lowered his rifle. Grace was still holding hers tight, white-knuckled, breathing hard. Then, finally, she exhaled. "That it?" she asked. "That's it," he said. But they both knew. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Only now, it belonged to them. The sun rose over the field, casting a warm copper glow across the grass. The wind no longer felt harsh. It moved gently through the trees, like it had settled, just like the house. The land beneath their feet hadn't changed, still dry, still stubborn. But now, it was theirs. Not by paper. By the right of those who refused to give it up. Grace walked along the fence line, fingertips brushing the fresh wood. She and Edward had fixed it just the day before. From the backyard came the sound of Josh laughing as he chased chickens, wild and free. And in the air, not just quiet, there was trust. Edward stood on the porch, leaning against the post, watching her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Love doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it's in how someone helps mend a broken house, or stays when leaving would be easier, or in the way they look at you. And suddenly, it's easier to breathe. There were no vows, no promises, just two people, still standing. And that was enough. If this story moved you, give it a like and share it with someone who still believes in the quiet power of doing what's right. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong.